Good afternoon, everybody. Should we get going?
Yes, you can go ahead, Emily.
Okay. Perfect. Emiliano, Joanna, Katherine, can I ask you to unmute yourselves, please? And Joanna, we also need your video, by the way. Let's wait and see. Hi. Okay. Are we good to go? Okay, perfect. Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everybody, depending on where you are in the world and joining us from. My name is Emilie Max, and I have the great pleasure of moderating this online event today on generating respect for humanitarian norms, the less explored avenues. We are joined by three distinguished panelists from Argentina and the UK, I believe, who I will introduce in a second. Let me just explain how it would work from a logistical perspective. We've gone for the usual setting where each of our panelists will get about 15 minutes for his or her presentation. We'll take the presentations in turn, and then this will leave time for hopefully a lively question and answer sessions with you participants. The way you can ask questions is through the chat box on Zoom. We'll take questions in the first come, first served order, and if there are many questions related to the same topics, we'll try to group them to address as many as possible. And also you will only be able to hear and see from us, the panelists, for safety reasons. That's why we haven't allowed your microphones or cameras, because in the past, not at the Geneva Academy, but at other events, we know that there have been security incidents. So thank you for understanding this choice, and I look forward to the discussion later on. Without further ado, I will introduce our panelists today. First, we have Joanna Sismas, who is a reader at the York Law School and Center for Applied Human Rights, and she is also the principal investigator for a project on generating respect for humanitarian norms, the influence of religious leaders on parties to the armed conflict. We are then also joined by Katherine Foster, who is an assistant professor at the Netherlands Institute of Human Rights at the University of Utrecht. And she is the principal investigator of her own research project called Dangerous Liaisons, Civilian Agency, Armed Groups, and International Law. And last but not least, we are joined by Emiliano Buis in Buenos Aires, Argentina. He is a professor of international law at the University of Buenos Aires and a permanent researcher at the, forgive my pronunciation, Consejo Nacional de Investigaciones Científicas y Técnicas. So, wonderful. Thank you. So we'll start with Joanna. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be part of this amazing panel with Katherine and Emiliano, who happen to also be members of the advisory board of the project Generating Respect for Humanitarian Norms, the influence of religious leaders on parties to armed conflict. The project is what I will be talking about today. But before that, I just want to say that I had spent 5, maybe 6 years at the Geneva Academy in various capacities, and it's nice to be back, albeit virtually. So thank you very much for organizing this event and for hosting it, Emily. So what I would like to do today is to, well, firstly share my screen. Let's see if we manage. We made a test, so it should work.
Yes, it does.
And no, that was the wrong button I pressed. It just goes right. Okay, so you should be able now to see what I'm seeing. The presentation of the project, not the usual suspects, religious leaders as influencers of compliance with humanitarian norms. So what I would like to do today is to discuss why we aim to look beyond the tried and tested methods of generating compliance with humanitarian norms. Why not stick to what we have? The second thing that I would like to discuss is how can we think about religious leaders as interpreters and influencers of parties to armed conflict? Who are they? What do they do? Do we have any examples out there? The third thing, why would an armed actor, whether it's a state actor or a non-state armed actor, comply with anything that the religious leaders would say? So why are they influenceable, or would they be influenceable? And the fourth thing, I would like to talk about our research agenda in the Generating Respect project. So the things that we don't quite know yet, but would very much like to know, because we think that would help us devise tools for humanitarian engagement with religious leaders. So let me start then with generating compliance with humanitarian norms. Why should we think outside the box? That's appreciated. So compliance has been defined as behavioral conformity with existing norms and regulations, but it rarely is so simple. In fact, compliance in reality is much more on a spectrum than on an on-off switch. Ezequiel Hefes, who's coordinating the Generating Respect project together with me and who works for Geneva Co, has just co-authored an article on Geneva Co's engagement with non-state armed groups in respect to the recruitment of child soldiers. And what they show is that there are lots of drivers and factors that influence the behavior of non-state armed groups. And it's a question of not necessarily just motivations, but it's a question of the time. So compliance at one time, whereas not complying at another time may occur, of context, very important aspects. And then there are systematic challenges or systemic challenges and institutional challenges. So the systematic should actually be institutional on the presentation. The systemic challenges to humanitarian norms, faced by humanitarian norms, really come from the way the legal regimes themselves function. If non-state armed groups and states do not consider that an armed conflict is taking place, then the trigger for the application of IHL is in fact challenged. So that's a systemic challenge. Another big systemic challenge, as the audience that is listening to us would know, is the problem of accountability. How do you hold non-state armed groups as well as states accountable for violations of IHL primarily, but also for international human rights law? So despite the fact that we see a proliferation of courts, international courts, regional courts, hybrid courts, and we have UN treaty bodies, regional human rights courts, still it's a minority of the violations that are being addressed through the court systems. In addition to this, we have what I would call institutional challenges. So this has to do with the ability of the parties to an armed conflict to understand the rules, their capacity to implement them in practice. It has to do with resources. It has to do with access to knowledge. So again, it's not necessarily an issue of motivation. It's rather an issue of institutional fragility. And this is more important, particularly important when you deal with the fragmentation of armed groups, where you deal with volatile and complex situations, the ones that we deal with today. So what were the traditional approaches to generate compliance with international law? Or what are, because they remain the dominant ones? Well, the dominant approach is to engage directly with parties to an armed conflict and to convince them to integrate, in particular, IHL norms in their training manuals, in their accountability measures, in their discipline measures. And this very much remains the main strategy. However, for the past 2 decades, we see a development towards trying to reach out to third parties, if you would. Third parties are those that maybe may have a certain influence in society in a given context or more broadly. And among them, we see religious leaders. And we have documented this with Ezekiel in a recent article. We have the ICRC, we have Geneva Con and other humanitarian organizations, we have the UN, various organizations in the UN, we certainly have development organizations engaging very much on an ad hoc basis for various purposes, training purposes, for local access to ensure or to facilitate local access purposes. So there seems to be a sort of a shift in understanding that traditional approaches are not enough, if there was ever an understanding that they're enough, but towards really systematically looking for these third parties that may influence behaviors of parties to armed conflict. And I would cite here the roots of restraint in war output, the project output, that really seems to signalize, if not a paradigm shift, at least an understanding that we need other measures beyond direct engagement. Okay, so let me come to religious leaders as integrators and influencers. What are they? What do they do? So what they are, at least this is the working definition of our project, they are individuals with a formal or informal affiliation to any religion or belief that claim a special legitimacy, which is grounded predominantly in tradition and charisma, to interpret religion and to command obedience from their followers. Now, the asterisks that you see there should remind me today that while we're looking at individuals in this project, religious leadership rarely is expressed really just in the form of one individual. They usually work in networks or in formal groups or informal groups, and those groups can really be interreligious. So that was the asterisk. And also you can have institutional forms of religious leadership. So you would be asking me, if you would be able to, about some examples of religious leaderships. And when I prepared for this presentation, and really in the past few years that I'm working on this topic, I found it more difficult to choose. In other words, there are so many examples. So I'm going to give you very briefly some examples. One of them comes from Israel. So what we see in Israel is in relation to the role of the Israeli Defense Forces rabbinate, where repeated religious leaders have had such an immense influence on the structure of the rabbinate that some scholars argued that the role of religion in the army right now is essential to the point that it's co-founding the authority of the IDF, whereas the command remains in civilian hands. The legitimacy is very much co-founded by the role of religious actors within the IDF. A second example that I could speak in detail about, but I don't think I have the time. Am I right? Emily, just note, please, if I'm running out of time.
Not yet, but a little bit.
Is the ISIS and the role of religious leadership that is very much embedded within the structure of ISIS. Sorry, you seem to be frozen. So I'm wondering if you can still hear me.
Yes, we can.
Okay, brilliant. The beauty of online webinars, my connection is unstable, I'm sorry.
No.
I was just told that my connection is unstable. So we see a direct influence in ISIS from the religious structures, and the influence is not towards generating compliance, but is towards generating violation. They're so direct. We explore them in the article that I mentioned that is coming out later this year in the Yearbook of International Humanitarian Law. Yeah, so with these two examples in mind, how can we think about this relationship between religious leaders and armed actors more theoretically? What I suggest to do is to look at sociological insights. And if we do that, and we are going to read a lot of Max Weber to come to this, we are going to think about the relationship between religious leaders and armed actors as the one between authorities and power subjects. And therefore, the relationship is one of command obedience. So legitimacy provides a sense of duty or an oughtness towards rules or legal norms issued by an authority, in this case, religious leaders. What's different with religious leaders from non-religious leaders, I wouldn't necessarily call them secular, but non-religious leaders, is that the sources of the legitimacy of religious leaders are mainly charisma and tradition. So we're not talking here about the rational legal, primarily about the rational legal sources of legitimacy. And this is really very important because we have that legitimacy, the rational legal legitimacy, in IHL itself. That's the main way of legitimating IHL. That's why we do trainings. That's why we incorporate IHL in accountability mechanisms. What we need is the other part of legitimacy, that tradition and charisma that will say, yes, indeed, this is a way to behave in times of war. So this is why religious leaders are important, because of this source of legitimacy that they claim to enjoy. Not all enjoy them. It should be very clear that not all religious leaders are influential. Very much depends on various factors. So in our view, legitimacy here, the legitimacy of religious leaders can function as a mechanism for generating compliance. But as I mentioned in the ISIS example, it can very well function as a mechanism for generating violations. So what do we want to do in our research project? What we want to do is to understand what motivates religious leaders to put forward those interpretations of religions which seek to further the compliance with humanitarian norms. And there are various ways to look at this, to answer this question, and you will have some theoretical underpinnings. You can look at religious leaders as brokers. You can look at them as having ownership over humanitarian norms, and some of the factors that we have identified and we will explore further are of ownership are the religious values themselves, the local laws, whether they're religious laws or non-religious norms and customs. Protections indeed by IHL may also enhance this ownership of humanitarian norms, as well as protection of freedom of religion. A second point on our research agenda is to understand what are the factors that may maximize the special legitimacy of religious leaders in times of armed conflict, and therefore their influence on compliance, on generating compliance. And here we have a huge list of factors. And from the examples that I gave before, I just want to point out two factors. The first one is the relationship and the role of the religious leader with or within the structure of an armed actor. So we see again a spectrum. Depending on where we are on the spectrum, the influence may be higher or lower. Of course, religious affinity, whether they share the same religion, would also play into these factors. Then there are other extra religious factors, such as the means of accessing parties and effective communities. Is it a direct way of engagement of religious leaders with the party, or is it mediated through media? Social media is playing a huge role recently, including religious leaders' social media. And then their participation and readiness to participate in dialogue with humanitarian organizations and with other religious leaders from different religions. So my very final point would be that we should also, and it's important to our project, that we should think about how humanitarian organizations should engage with religious leaders. I think it's important to rebalance, to balance the relationship and to understand what humanitarian organizations are trying to achieve with the engagement. Mm-hmm. So the difference between, for instance, the UNDP engaging with some religious leaders in order, for development-related purposes and to ensure local access, and the reason why, let's say, Geneva Co would engage with them is different in many respects. Geneva Co interests would very much be, in my view, and I'm not saying Geneva Co is interested in this at all, to engage with those religious leaders, in particular with those religious leaders that put forward problematic interpretations of IHL, whereas UNDP in its guidelines on engagement of humanitarian norms clearly states that there would be a no-go. So there are differences because of the type of organizations that we're talking about. And this is it for me, and thank you very much. I'm looking forward to questions, and mostly I'm looking forward to listening to the presentations of Emiliano and Katherine. This is how you can contact me if you're interested. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jana, for this interesting presentation and perspective. So I believe it's Katherine's turn now, and that her presentation will focus on armed non-state actors, which are one of the two types of armed actors that Joanna touched upon in her own presentation. Thank you, Katherine. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, first of all, I'm very grateful to the Geneva Academy for the invitation and to take part in this panel together with Emiliano and Joanna. And I'm also grateful to have the opportunity to present some aspects of this research project, which I just started in February, so at the same, more or less the same time the coronavirus hit, and which is called, as you already indicated, is looking at civilian agency, armed groups and international law. It's funded by the Netherlands Research Organization, NWO. And I want to start the presentation kind of by zooming out and explaining some of the core ideas that sit at the heart of the project, and then zooming in to address the subject of the panel, which relates to compliance. So the project has some core, emerged out of some observations and trends and core ideas. First of all, it emerged out of the idea that today's armed conflicts are extremely protracted. And what that means is that civilian populations are living in territory under the control of armed groups for many years sometimes. It also emerged out of writings in other disciplines relating to this notion of civilian agency, which is essentially the idea that civilians carry on making decisions and about the course of their lives and taking actions designed to protect themselves and their communities in times of armed conflict. This literature sort of is seeking to nudge the image of the civilian that's portrayed in narratives of armed conflict towards being constituents, stakeholders, participants, rather than being associated with words such as passive, vulnerable, victims. And in many cases, it's also trying to explain that these two states can coexist, that you can be at the same time empowered and active and at the same time be a victim and vulnerable. Finally, the project emerged out of an observation that humanitarian NGOs doing programming on the ground are increasingly pursuing the kind of programming that's locally owned. So in doing so, they're often seeing how civilians, communities can have some ownership within that programming. And some are embracing this notion of civilian agency. And some are indeed exploring ways in which civilians can secure their own protection and advocate for their own rights vis-a-vis armed actors. So motivated out of that kind of contextual background, my project is looking at the ways in which the legal framework captures or responds to civilian agency. It's looking at the ways in which the legal framework has scope to encapsulate the image of a civilian as a constituent, as a participant, as being involved without somehow compromising the principle of distinction. And as one of the 4 sub-questions of the project, I'm looking at the way in which civilians can exercise agency within the legal framework of international humanitarian law. And so this part of the project came out of an observation that so much literature and international law relating to non-international armed conflicts reproduces these macro narratives of armed conflicts, where the focus is really on the parties. So an identification of the parties, who are they, how are they structured, and an identification of their obligations. So what are the obligations, how are they binding? And the stuff I've written also very squarely falls into this category. And finally, there's a lot been written, of course, on classification, which likewise flows from an identification of the parties. So these macro narratives of armed conflict. And I think that this focus is reproduced then when one looks at literature on compliance, which the most common approach, as Joanna already indicated, is advocacy efforts to address the duty bearers. So advocacy efforts, let's say, at the top of the legal framework. So the state or the non-state actor. And even the more innovative compliance mechanisms that we've got in the form of the Geneva Core Deed of Commitment model that approach. So they seek to address the armed actor, and energy is put into clarifying the norm and creating ownership of the norm by engaging with that armed actor. Now, in other disciplines relating to the study of armed conflict, it's interesting that there have been quite considerable shifts away from these macro narratives of armed conflict towards more micro and meso narratives of armed conflict that focus on the individual experience of armed conflict and the community experience of armed conflict. And it seems to me that there's much more work that can be done in international law, capturing and addressing those micro and meso narratives too. So notably on the looking at engagement and compliance, I became aware of a number of developments in this area which seemed very interesting. First, a lot of literature on civilian agency seems to show that civilian communities living in territory under the control of armed groups are very regularly engaging with, interacting with armed actors as a means of securing their protection or negotiating safe spaces. The extent to which it's possible and happens will of course depend on the context, the armed actor, but it seems to suggest that it happens more often than is perhaps often captured. I also noticed that there are actually a number of specific projects on which this dynamic is being utilized. So you'll see that in the Roots of Restraint of War report that Joanna's already mentioned, it makes remark that this is an area that could be greater explored. Civic is an NGO that I'd like to mention in this regard. It's an NGO based in Washington, DC, and I've been particularly drawn to their work in Afghanistan, where they have been doing exactly this. So they've been equipping civilian populations with better tools to advocate for their own needs directly against armed actors. And they have a number of initiatives, but they've set up community civilian protection committees that are made up of community leaders. And their function is to be abreast of all protection related issues, gathering information and on community needs and violations, and holding discussions, notably not only with the non-state actor, but also with the government actors where appropriate. And using, of course, a number of tools in their advocacy toolbox that may be drawing on religious norms, cultural norms, and also law in order to approach the armed actor directly. So why is it important to explore these kind of alternative avenues? In my view, it's important because it presents a different avenue of ownership and a different way of conceiving the norm. So it articulates and encourages, I think, an ownership of the norm at the bottom, so in the community at an individual level. And I think that this picture is quite new for IHL, because unlike human rights law, it's not generally articulated in this way. And of course, there are several reasons for this that I can see. The first lies in the way IHL is drafted. So if you just take Common Article 3 and you see the way it's drafted, it's a very obvious provision that could have been written in terms of rights, but it's written instead addressing the parties in the imperative, using words such as shall and prohibited. I think also, of course, we've got a lack of enforcement mechanisms in IHL, meaning we've got less examples of individuals using the legal framework in this way from a bottom-up perspective to secure their protection. And I think it may also be partly influenced by the fact that the civilian has traditionally generally been portrayed in a kind of passive, vulnerable way, as perhaps uninvolved, with the idea that they need to remain uninvolved in order to stay protected. I think possibly there's been a lot of nervousness around the risks in civilians taking on these roles, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. So why can it be helpful? Well, it can be helpful because it seems research shows that civilians are adopting these roles already. It's also notable that civilian communities are on the ground first in these situations of armed conflict. They're often on the ground last. So after the international community is gone, and this has been noted in a lot of the kind of paradigm shift literature relating to the participation revolution in humanitarian planning. Civilian communities can also articulate their concerns, addressing the kind of receptor box of the armed group in a very authentic way. So utilizing religious arguments, legal arguments, cultural arguments in a way that they have ownership of. They are, because of the synergies between themselves and the armed group from a cultural background. So essentially, what you're doing in this model is they're delivering these arguments from a place of ownership because the middle entity has been removed. I'm coming to the end now, but what I want to indicate is that this practice is, of course, risky, and it's one of the things that I want to look at in my project. So I'm really studying it from trying to gather where this is happening and look at it as an opportunity, and study it also from a theoretical perspective relating to the image of the civilian as a rights holder, as an agent. But I'm also wanting to explore the risks involved. There are examples of civilian leaders who have been killed by armed groups who suspect that they're allied to the government, and there are also risks that civilians will be perceived by the government as being too closely associated with the armed group. Mm-hmm. And I think that as it seems that different parties working in this area are exploring this avenue, it's important that these risks are properly evaluated as a matter of law and practice. I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Katherine. What I take from your presentation and from Joanna's as well is that you both have very exciting research projects who might challenging the narrative that we've heard about IHL and compliance and engaging various actors. So I'm putting new ideas forward and looking at actors, civilians and religious leaders that haven't been looked at enough to maybe put forward ideas that aim or contribute at grasping the complexity of armed conflicts today. So thanks. And now, last but not least, we turn to Emiliano, who, if I'm not mistaken, is going to talk about emotions and compliance with humanitarian norms. So bringing an additional layer of complexity and novelty to the discussion today.
Thank you very much, Emily. I'm thrilled to be with wonderful colleagues discussing about this amazing topics. So I also join them in thanking not only the Geneva Academy, but also York University for putting together this amazing panel. So in one of the very few non-coronavirus related conferences these days, I will run the risk of start speaking about the pandemic in order to introduce some aspects of my arguments. As you have seen, wartime rhetoric has been pervading the news about healthcare personnel in the last days. So a wide range of military metaphors have been creating a compelling imagery. As a paper has suggested, we have an invisible enemy, which is the virus, a strategy, which is to flatten the curve. We have frontline warriors with not sufficient ammunition, which are the doctors. We have the home front, people isolating, and we even have traitors and deserters, people breaking the social distancing rules. So the analogy here is very clear. I do agree with those who consider that this is very dangerous concerning the securitization of health. But in some unexpected ways, I believe that this comparison can eventually be useful, and I will try to expand on this. First of all, war discloses a strong emotional rhetoric. Mm-hmm. It is omnipresent in the discourse against the coronavirus. So solidarity and endurance are necessary to overcome fear and anxiety, and therefore we need this in order to enjoy the pleasures of life, that is peace again. So basically there is a language that is overwhelming. The second point, which is interesting, is that in this aspect, there's this importance of relying on comparative studies in order to try to discuss the best suitable answer to the pandemic in medical terms. The debate around the extension of lockdown, for instance, is an example. So people around the world do not seem to face the same challenges. These countries, they compare themselves to others and attribute success or failure to social habits, maybe cultural predisposition to isolation in certain places, or in some cases, propensity to hugging or kissing in other contexts. So being in cities or towns could also make a difference. And concerning also the consequences of the measures taken, men, women, and children also respond differently to the pandemic. So basically, this is because there are pre-established roles, social values, perceptions, family, and community expectations around. At the same time, these specificities need to be left aside for the sake of global measures. So the overall protection of physical and mental health requires generalizing. So let's think now of international humanitarian law on the basis of this analogy. As with the medical fight against the virus, when we are in wartime, we believe in the need to overcome the uncertainty through the establishment of rational, universal scientific rules to respect. So basically IHL becomes what I would call the universally accepted framework we require in times of exception. But of course, just like it happens in war, people have their own experiences of war and their own perceptions, which is key in health policies. So basically the protection provided by IHL depends on a number of features that may vary according to each context. In my opinion, focusing on this aspect might pave the road to more comprehensive ways of addressing compliance in IHL. So let's start with the problem of compliance in international law in general. So back in 1979 already, Louis Henking said that states generally comply with their obligations under international law for a number of reasons. Some areas of international law, however, have been basically perceived as dark holes. And this is where IHL comes to play. IHL has traditionally been considered one of those areas in which violations are mostly at the heart of the debate. The ICRC started changing the narratives after convening a panel of experts trying to discuss new ways of thinking of IHL, and they even launched an online platform in order to compile real-life instances of compliance with the law. So the question on the basis for respect, in my opinion, can only be answered by considering extra legal aspects. So the aim of my global research, and I'm just launching this research in these terms, is basically to show the importance of emotions to understand IHL in action, to discuss also specific case studies to show that the affective dimension can enhance our understanding of how IHL works, and to show that emotional in-group and out-group experiences and cultural awareness might promote a better adherence to norms on the basis of the construction of affective networks. So concerning armed conflicts, and Joanna just mentioned this, Geneva called, for instance, said frequently that non-state actors do not violate or respect international law at large. So they may follow certain rules at a certain point, at the same time, they disregard others. Only a case-by-case study will show that non-state actors often modify their behavior depending on their own purpose, and this implies an increase or decrease in their level of commitment and compliance with humanitarian rules. The ICRC has also showed, and this is the report that both Joanna and Katherine mentioned, that an armed group's organizational structure may determine its behavior. And in this sense, unlike the previous report, now it becomes very clear that disseminating knowledge of the law is not enough. So the legal tactic should be complemented by social perception. And social perception, of course, involves how these organizations feel and believe. So the ICRC report analyzes different types of armed conflicts, armed grouped organizations, in order to show how they might react differently and should be approached under different strategies. So in spite, I would say, of the importance of paying attention to these considerations, there is a tendency to rationalize these attitudes. For instance, armed groups are analyzed as weighing the costs versus the benefits of complying with international law, which is a very rational line of thought, and even classifying their behavioral variations according to their objective of organization and to their internal dynamics also relies on a very rational point of view. These ideas relate to what I call a set of rationalist misconceptions in IHL, which stems from the acknowledgement that in order to ensure compliance, we must understand the rational and logical considerations promoting the actor's decisions. Of course, there are some reasons here. We might think that the passions of law need to be overcome by the reason of legal restraint. So there is a logical here. But this does not allow us to rationalize IHL. In fact, IHL is emotional, and this is important when discussing the limits to its compliance. So thinking of the importance of those perceptions and values that ought to be taken into account when enlarging our comprehension of IHL can benefit greatly from the so-called affective turn that has entered the social sciences quite recently. So the study of emotions, deemed to be cultural constructions according to cognitive psychology, sheds light on attitudes and behaviors by identifying perceptions and local values. So it can therefore prove that the mainstream legalistic approach is insufficient and that we need interdisciplinary tools and strategies to understand the reasons behind respect. Some recent texts, in fact, have tried to show that people involved in IHL respond to emotional biases. In his book, Emotional Diplomacy, for instance, Hall has shown that diplomats play with their own emotions and that of others in order to convey messages and even to react to proposals. Hutchison and Ross, for instance, have dealt with the affective experience of civilians, both during war and after the traumatic effect of armed conflicts. Judges sitting in international tribunals are also determined by their emotions when deciding on specific cases, as shown by Clark when analyzing the ICC in her recent book on affective justice, which is, by the way, the object of an Opinio Juris symposium just this very week. So cultural anthropology of emotions, and let's say that Clark is an anthropologist herself, is useful to understand the reality of armed conflicts and the attitudes of those who are involved, since it supports the need to focus on the study of specific cultures and group beliefs, practices, and behaviors. From a relational and social legal approach, a colleague of us, Rebecca Sutton, has studied the feelings of humanitarian actors. Through field work conducted in Africa or at civil military trainings, she showed that everyday distinction impacts the relationship with others, especially victims of war. Victims are usually depicted as the objects of mistrust, of fear, of potential danger, as perceivers of aids, of beneficiaries. So this civilian combatant binary needs to be overcome by a more nuanced appeal to emotions. So there is also a civilian-civilian tension basically when we think of what Rebecca calls different gradations of civilianness, of perceptions of how one behaves as a civilian. So IHL places us in front of each other's cultural perceptions. So to understand the role and efficiency, we must do that on a bottom-up basis. To endorse universal rules, we should make them relevant in local contexts for specific group cultures. Dominique Moissy has explained that countries are embedded in group cultures which define their strategic positions and explain their international behaviors. This national level, which is addressed by Moissy, should be complemented, in my opinion, by the existence of different collective approaches to victimization, for example, or by the plurality of organizational cultures within different NGOs, or even the diverse military in-group practices, sometimes, for instance, rooted in very masculine perceptions of the role of the military. So in all these instances, group belonging shapes the way individuals engaged with IHL. So far from this universal one-size-fits-all methodology, I believe that IHL requires local realities to be understood when trying to apply the relevant rules. So respecting, for instance, the sanction for war crimes in international courts, for instance, might become very difficult for the Acholi population in northern Uganda, who are used to achieving justice and reconciliation by ritually sharing a common bitter drink in the ceremony of Mato Uput. So the final question is how to promote this sort of emotional awareness in humanitarian actors. And one way, in my opinion, is through emotional training, as it is the case of the Jean Pictet competition, just to mention one of these examples, where students are requested to play different roles and become aware of different perceptions. So participants are faced with challenges that make them reflect on different approaches, very specific approaches, initiatives, in order to basically make sense of the emotions and perceptions of the individuals who are expected to enact or comply with IHL provisions. So the ICRC has been able to develop strategies to reach parties and ensure compliance, because sometimes it is, of course, perceived to be a neutral and impartial agency. So in fact, this subjective image by the ICRC, in my opinion, has allowed for its success. However, when impartiality is not enough to persuade, for humanitarian actors who approach the armed forces or organized groups, social understanding and cultural empathy might be sometimes more efficient than quoting the relevant applicable legal provisions. So working in hostile environments or addressing their consequences means engaging with the human constituent, approaching them and generating trust and mutual respect. To conclude, and of course there's many things that I could also focus on, I'll just make it very short there. My impression is, and this is what I would like to discuss with you, is that at the end of the day, when trying to promote compliance, an anthropological perspective based on emotion and focused on the importance of individual and group feelings can prove maybe to be as useful as the Geneva Conventions themselves. Thank you very much.
Sorry, I was in mute, sorry. Thank you so much, Emiliano, for this third thought-provoking presentation. We've had a few questions asked already by our participants. So I'll start with a question to Katherine. It relates to one of the points you talked about, but what are your thoughts on how to promote or recognize civilian agency without compromising the principle of distinction? And I'd like to hear Emiliano about this as well, because you mentioned a more nuanced approach to the notion of civilian. Katherine, you're on mute. You're on mute.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I have perhaps two answers to it. on the one hand, or at least I have a practical answer to it and I have a more research-orientated answer to it. I'll give you the research-orientated answer first. I think first of all, it's very important to make an appraisal, and it's one of the things I want to do, of the definitions that we have of the approaches different states take to the membership criteria and the DPH criteria, to see the extent to which this kind of agency in relation to interacting with armed groups is hopefully falls on the right side of the principle of distinction. I wouldn't ever constitute DPH or membership. But I'm not entirely confident about that. And one of the reasons is that I think that we haven't got that many manuals out there in the public eye, but one that we do have is the DoD manual. And I think that the wording in that is quite ambiguous, particularly when they talk about the indicators for the functional membership of an armed group. So they talk about formal membership criteria and functional membership criteria. And certainly in the functional membership criteria, there are indicators given relating to interactions between civilian populations and armed groups. And I find that worrying, and I think that it requires in some ways to tackle that more knowledge out there, also going to the military about just how everyday these interactions can be and how few conclusions can actually be drawn from them with regards to a civilian's behavior. That's the research-orientated answer. The practice-orientated answer, I think, and I say this also having spoken to a few people who work in this area, is that it's important for civilians to be very clear about what they're doing, I think, when they are approaching armed actors and what their aim is, and to stick to, and this is where my answer may differ a bit to Emiliano's and why it's good you ask him the question too, but to stick to the issue, which is the protection of civilians. So to rely, as it were, on the impartiality and humanitarian principle which are embedded in the legal framework, i.e. their concern is not to solve the armed conflict or to be a mediator between the warring parties or to get embroiled in the politics of the armed conflict, but they're going with a very narrow mission to deal with a particular protection concern. And I think that if civilians do that, that would be one way of ensuring that the agency doesn't step over that line.
Mm-hmm. Emiliano?
Yeah. Well, basically, I mean, the idea of my research project on emotions and how this might deal with the difference and the protection of civilians as distinction has basically to do with the perceptions. Mm-hmm. So traditionally, and I concur with Katherine when she moves a little the shift, because I think that one of the ideas behind this emotional paradigm is to focus on the experience of different actors from different perspectives, is basically to see that the principle of distinction has been created basically from the top to the bottom. So it's basically the armed forces that need to require this distinction in order to perceive civilians as someone that has to be protected. When you turn around and you start seeing how the sociology of civilian behavior reacts to an armed conflict, you will see that under this definition by exclusion, which is civilians is that person who's not someone who's directly participating in hostilities, mm-hmm. Civilians require protection. In that sense, you will see that depending on the context, and this is why I was talking about case-by-case scenarios, you will see that different local group cultures might define different positions concerning how civilians perceive their differences and how civilians perceive this idea of distinction. I'm not only relying on what Rebecca Sutton said concerning this multiplicity of civilianness, if you would like to, but basically the idea that even within cultures of victimization and within cultures of shame, which might share some emotional background, you will see that the ways in which civilians react to this distinction might be completely different. I would just put an example. The way in which, for instance, civilian activism is produced after an experience of trauma might change radically from one emotional culture to the other ones. In Latin America, we're very used to seeing the victims of, for instance, the relatives of those people who were subjected to enforced disappearances, actively participating through civilian activism. The Abuelas de Plaza de Mayo is an example of how the emotion related to grief has transformed into an active participation in post-conflict situations. Whether in other areas where other emotional cultures might differ, you would not see this sort of NGO activism. I have a researcher who's working with me, and she has been studying the differences between how civilians have acted after the dictatorships in Latin America with the African situations after the armed conflicts. And you will see that in-group perceptions and out-group perceptions change radically. And this has to do not only with traditional ways of perceiving shame, perceiving guilt, perceiving what reconciliation might mean, but how they respond to the experience of trauma. So my idea is that if we shift the idea of distinction from the general perspective, from the rational perspective of a member of the armed forces that in a certain operation should have this clear reasoning of binary opposition, and we focus on the other side of the relationship, then I think that the emotional paradigm might suggest that we should draw the lines differently.
Okay, thank you. Now a question for Joanna. So the question, yeah.
Just interrupt you. I think there is a question on distinction as well related to religious personnel. So I'm just wondering if I can make that one now, because it really just, it follows on what Emiliano. Yeah. So I think, if you don't mind, I think it's a question from a student of the Geneva Academy.
Yes. Yeah, it is. So the question is, if you have religious personnel involved in help, I mean, she says helping non-state actors to comply with IHL, wouldn't the religious personnel lose their protection?
Yes. Well, there is a short answer and a more complex answer. And the more complex answer builds on what Emiliano has said before. Mm-hmm. Really, it's how do you define help here? And then we should look back at what the norm says. The norm talks about religious personnel exclusively assigned to religious duties must be respected and protected, and they lose their protection if they commit outside their humanitarian function acts harmful to the enemy. And I would say engaging with parties to the conflict to generate greater compliance with the norms can be very well within their humanitarian functions. In fact, many religious interpretations would require that's where the ownership comes. This is part of many religious interpretations already, so it wouldn't. So I don't think there would be a problem. But I should say, and I really want to stress this, in our project, the Generating Respect project, we don't see a perfect, on the contrary, we don't see a perfect overlap between religious personnel and religious leaders. Mm-hmm. So this is very important. So you may have religious leaders that can't be qualified, they do not fulfill the definition in IHL of religious personnel. They may, but they also may not. And then, of course, it's all in the definition of what they actually do. Yes, so I just wanted to answer to that question, given that it built on.
We've had other. Yes, Catherine.
I just wanted to add that I think that another legal framework that is at play here is, of course, the counterterrorism frameworks that are so becoming increasingly important when it relating to individuals approaching armed actors. So indeed, the question relating to distinction is a really important one because it relates to whether someone is risking their life. But I think it's also very important to take awareness of the law within the country relating to the criminal sanctions for being in touch with groups or being perceived to be helping them by helping them navigate a legal framework.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Thanks. Especially, you know, with the whole debate with regards to the US definition, broad definition of material support. There was additional questions for both Joanna and Emiliano, and Catherine, feel free to jump in. Gianna, there was a question that I found very interesting, and it's basically, it says that some aspects of IHL or of human rights, such as the right to life or the consideration of the prohibition of cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, differs from different religions based on their interpretation of sacred texts. And in that regard, do you think that encouraging dialogue based on IHL and human rights between religious leaders could support in the harmonization of the understanding of the legal framework that can be reflected in a positive way? And I guess it's a question that goes a little bit against the very nuanced, culturally sensitive approach that Emiliano was advocating in favor of.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm just trying to identify the question. Oh yeah, I see it. It's from Elizabeth. Yeah.
Exactly.
I would actually like to start with the framing of this question. To cite here, let's see the right to life, and let's refer to the human rights framework. It differs by different religions. So the way the right to life is treated in different religions is different. Now, what I do, what I've done in my work, for instance, in Religious Actors and International Law, which was published in 2014, is to shift the focus. So my focus is not on religion. Religion can be a lot of things. Is actually on the interpretation of a religion by religious actors. Mm-hmm. And the reason why I shifted this focus, and I insist in this project as well, that the focus needs to be shifted from religion to religious actor, is because we can prove that every religion, if we understand religion in a static way, and in a not complex way, so unlike it actually is, any religion conflicts with human rights, so IHL and many other legal regimes. And I'll just give you one concrete example. I'm going to cite from Exodus 21:12 that reads, "He that killed a man so that he die shall be surely put to death." So this is in the Bible. The Bible says that a person that was killed should be killed. So does that mean that Catholicism embraces the death penalty? No, it doesn't. On the contrary, in the US, the Catholic Church is at the forefront of the abolition of the death penalty movement. So what's happening here is that the John Paul II reinterpreted phrases in the Bible that endorse the death penalty in such a way so as to exclude it. And he has done that. This is quite rare. He has done that systematically, saying that that interpretation in the Bible does not conform to the modern times. And there are other non-lethal means of punishment that are more in keeping with the concrete conditions of the common good and more in conformity with the dignity of the human person. So what I'm saying here is that we will find interpretations by various actors in various religions that either conflict or comply with IHL. And we have to work with this complexity. We need to acknowledge it, and we need to look at the agency of the actors. We should also look at the, and I think this is really important, we should look at the legal norms themselves. They themselves are dynamic, they themselves change, and it is actors that interpret them. Mm-hmm. So you deal with complexity and dynamism on both sides. So it's really important to acknowledge that and to avoid this inevitable conflict that is portrayed between law and religion, whatever law. Mm-hmm. It will always exist if you look just at the books. If you look at interpretations, various interpretations, it may or it may not exist. There may be some points of conflict and tension. There may be other points that, are not in tension. And you may also find interpretations in religions that advance certain areas of IHL and human rights. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's where I'm coming from, and that's where this project is coming from, and that's why we focus on the religious leaders as opposed to focusing on Islam or Buddhism or Catholicism or Judaism. Yeah.
Thanks. Do you want to add something, Emiliano?
Yes, just following on your comment about my nuanced approach, yes, and how to deal with this sort of proposal about interreligious dialogue and what this sort of dialogue might, how it might be useful in order to improve the way of just unifying interpretations. This is one of the examples of my idea of rationalizing. The idea that if you find a space for interreligious dialogue, then you will get to the right interpretation of how to deal with a sort of provision in IHL. And in fact, what my specific approach would suggest is basically that you should not only think of a religious community as a cultural community, but you might also find that within religious communities, you might find very different emotional networks. And there are some very specific groups which might share the same religion, but with a certain framework of understanding that religion. And they comply with religion in a way in which others who might share the same ideas and beliefs don't. So again, this has to be a bottom-up situation. And one of the interesting things that studying emotive language might provide you with, this is one of the areas of the project, is also how these religious leaders define themselves and are perceived within very specific groups of that community. And you see a number of affective language used there. Some religious leaders are deemed to be the fathers of the community, or the shepherds, or a spiritual guide. And I think that within those terms, you also play with very interpersonal analogies. I mean, you behave with your father in a very specific way, which is trying to comply with the family authority. So I also think that how the language is used and how people in very small communities perceive their leaders do not only change the way in which this might look like with other groups within the same religion, but also gives you a lot of input on how this authority is constructed, and therefore what role this person might play when it deals with respecting applicable norms or principles.
Thanks. So Emiliano, since you have the floor, one of the other questions that was addressed to you is by a participant called Katherine, and she was mentioning that emotional aspects and perception can also be part of the cost-benefit analysis.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Yeah, you can. I mean, that's why you cannot withdraw from this idea of a case-by-case study. So, in general, when you think of cost-benefit, in principle, what you might think is a sort of law and economics evaluation. So there's the rational perception of how to behave considering what good aspect you might get from that action, or what sort of prejudice you might get if you do that. But of course, I mean, emotions are involved in that process as well. One of the things that I did not say, but this is part of how cognitive psychologists are thinking about emotions, is that emotions are not necessarily opposed to reasons. And the thing is that sometimes when you focus on rationality, you tend to exclude emotions because you believe that emotions is not sufficiently scientific as far as a field of study is made. But in order to process the way in which you react, maybe on a cost-benefit analysis, of course emotions are there. The thing is that this is a sort of development. This is a sort of movement from first feeling or impact, then you process in your brain the ways in which you will react, and afterwards you get to a possible action. One of the things which is also confusing is that in general you think that rationality makes you act, whereas concerning emotions you react to something that is produced on you. Again, this is also not the case. I mean, emotions move you to act. That's why manipulating emotions, and this is something that Aristotle has said centuries ago, manipulating emotions is also a way in which you can use in a rational way your authority. Mm-hmm. leaders usually manipulate emotions. Leaders usually, they take advantage of their role of respect in order to produce certain effects. And that, at a certain point, very rational in a lot of ways. So yes, I would not say that reason and emotions go different directions or opposite sides. They're the two sides of the same coin.
So now it's a question about civilians living in territories controlled by armed groups, and I'd like to address it to you, Katherine. So most of those civilians know nothing about their rights, humanitarian norms, or compliance with IHL. How can we reach those civilians and promote public awareness? And what is the role of non-governmental organizations in this? And I'd like to pair this with a question I've received for Emiliano, which, do you think, Emiliano, that the language used by humanitarian actors, governmental and non-governmental, in reaching parties to armed conflicts has become neutral in a way that it's based on rationalization and not relying on emotions? So Katherine first, maybe?
Yeah, so, well, I'm guessing that people in the audience who work in this area may have also some interesting answers to this question as to whether or not civilian populations actually do know nothing about humanitarian norms. I think that a lot of work that's done also with armed groups is, and I think also some of the work which has been done using religious leaders has been about mapping points of contact between what we know as international law scholars as humanitarian norms and what other people, so in the traditional avenues of engagement, members of armed groups, might not know as a provision of international humanitarian law, but might nevertheless recognize as a norm. And finding a contact place between those two realities can indeed end up with compliance, or what we would think of compliance, even though the armed group may not be wishing to adhere to international humanitarian law in an explicit sense, or even be particularly aware that they're doing so. So, you know, we've got so many very core norms within international humanitarian law relating to the sick and wounded, relating to children, relating to people who are in captivity, norms relating to inhuman treatment. And indeed, whilst I would agree that nobody that you meet on the ground is going to be able to cite Common Article 3, there might actually be quite a lot of agreement on the prohibited conduct. And so I think that provides somewhat of an answer in that this doesn't require preaching an unfamiliar external norm and getting the buy-in from the civilian population before this work can be done. But of course, it does require access, which is also within your question. And in some contexts, the legal framework may be more useful than others. I can see Mark Linning from Civic in the chat box. And again, I'm going to quote Civic's work on this respect, because I already mentioned their community protection councils, but they also have a different network, which is a network of NGOs, which are also seeking in a kind of trickle down way to increase community awareness of IHL. The rights-based language, I think, is also interesting. It's not the language in which IHL tends to be spoken of. And I saw a very interesting tweet on Twitter not long ago asking, why don't we have IHL activists? Why don't we have this notion? Whereas we do have human rights activists. And I think the answer to that is very much embedded in my presentation and this kind of conceptual image of the civilian that's emerged, and the relationship between the civilian and the norm, and the right of the civilian to enforce that norm. And so I think perhaps that is an area where indeed more work can be done. I've always been struck, and I don't want to take up too much time, but I've always been struck by that provision in Geneva Convention 3, which requires the convention to be placed in the language of the prisoners on the wall of the camp, as just such a simple example of how powerful it can indeed be for people to know their rights and to know the rules that the people who are in positions of power are bound by. And of course, the ICRC does a lot of work on dissemination, and they do it in order to make sure that people adhere to IHL, but perhaps there's also more scope for people to be aware of themselves as rights holders in that regard.
Emiliano?
Yes, I had the question on neutral language and how this might affect humanitarian.
Exactly.
There's a very interesting book on emotive language by Walton and McCanyon, which published a number of years ago. And they say that neutral language, in fact, shows very well how neutrality can be very emotive. So because when you choose neutral language, it's because there are some emotional paradigms before that makes you use a language which is not compromised because of the situation. I think this is very clear. When you see humanitarian organizations prompted to use neutral expressions, what you find is a way of constructing themselves in a very specific way. I have been criticizing myself some of this sort of managerial approach in many NGOs and humanitarian actions, which tend basically to neutralize the way in which they approach specific communities. And again, this goes against this idea that you have to establish a relationship with specific communities based on very local variables. So on the one side, you have this idea that humanitarian organizations are there to offer empathy, compassion, understanding, et cetera, et cetera. On the other side, in order to, for instance, be listened by one of these organizations on the field, you have to fill some forms. And so you become a sort of object of this sort of managerism concerning humanitarian organizations. So what I think is that this sort of aseptic or neutrality, which sometimes is promoted by these humanitarian organizations in order to show that they're not becoming too involved with the situation, it shows a way of these organizations perceiving themselves in very emotional terms.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Jana, turning back to you. A question from Mark Linning from Civic. So he's curious about how the tensions or contradictions between religious norms and military command have been resolved. And he's mentioned, for instance, the IDF example you gave before.
Thank you, Mark. The very short answer is that in the IDF, they haven't been resolved. They're actually very high. I realize now that I gave two examples. They do not portray the influence of religious leaders to generating respect, but in fact to frustrating respect of the many examples that I could have picked. On a more serious note, there is some very good work done by Yagil Levy, specifically on the IDF, on the religious actors within the Israel military. And what he identifies is the way religious actors have increased their influence gradually from the 1970s onwards, through crafting institutional arrangements that enable the service of religious soldiers, through creating critical mass of religious soldiers in many combat units, and through restricting the military's command intra-organizational autonomy vis-a-vis the religious sector, to the point that he argues, and he's not the only scholar to argue that the idea of autonomy right now in deploying forces in some politically disputed missions is restricted. So as I said before, I was giving examples that weren't actually showing the potential of generating respect, but rather of frustrating respect. So I think the tensions exist, and if I may, Emily, I just want to speak of another tension that exists, and I think the first way to address this tension, it's really the principal way, the premise is to acknowledge the existing tensions. So one of the panelists, Vivian, is asking, how can we use innovative approaches if they are mediated by existing social norms that actually entrench inequality? So she says religious leaders or traditional leaders may represent patriarchal or majority groups in society. And how can approaches to engage with them ensure that women and minority groups who tend to be victims are in fact not treated just as victims, but as participants in the project, in the process of engagement? And you know, you're spot on. This is one of the big issues that we are dealing with. We are grappling with right now in the Generating Respect project. We're working in 4 countries: Mali, Colombia, Myanmar, and Libya. And we have done mapping of religious leaders and mapping of armed actors in these countries, and trying to identify points of entry of the influence and assess their influence. And one of the striking, but it's not striking, it's expected things, is that the majority of these religious leaders are men. And the way I thought of dealing with this in this project is to first think about how I define religious leadership. So the definition of what religious leadership is needs to be broad enough to ensure that things that may not immediately qualify as religious leadership, because women simply are less visible in the formal ways, are actually included, at least in the analysis and then going forward. So I'll give you an example. In the Solomon Islands, women church groups have been the main influencers during the transitional justice process in that country, because they were the main humanitarian actors, if you want, during the conflict. So the legitimacy translated from one point and the other. But if you actually do an analysis of the Solomon Islands, you would see as the main speaker, you know, discourses usually of male religious figures. So you're missing out the women. So it really depends of how you look at leadership and what you understand. So the definition is important. And the other way of looking at it is what influence is exactly. And I think here we again need to be very nuanced and context specific. But this may not solve the problem. So it's a tension that exists and it may not be solved.
Thank you. I would very much like to hear Katherine and Emiliano on that latter question about mediating existing social norms that entrench inequality in your respective research projects.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a really important question for me. I think I'm too early in my project to have an answer to the question, but it's certainly one that I think I really need to keep on the agenda. I think that particularly in my study of civilian agency, it's really important not to essentialize the other way and to kind of adopt an essentialist narrative of being civilian without taking due account of a spectrum of experiences, including indeed the groups that this person, Vivian, has asked. So I'll just say thank you and put it on my to-do list.
Emiliano?
Yep, I have to concur with Katherine. I don't have an answer so far, my idea, of course, is that, I mean, if you examine situations in particular, and I think that's the great point of the question, of course, there might be different ways of portraying inequality. So, I mean, what might mean inequality in a certain sense could not necessarily mean inequality in another one. Are we meaning that from a human rights perspective, we would find that these communities are not respecting certain global, what we consider global standards? In that sense, my impression is that we should draw, but again, I'm in the first part of the project, so I'm laying the theoretical foundations from all these different disciplines. I haven't started with specific case studies and interviews to see how this might act in different specific contexts. My impression, but this is some sort of general impression, is that we should draw on what has been said and discussed about human rights relativism. I think that could provide us with a way of showing in a certain way how to interact a system of universal human rights with situations in which specific communities believe in reproducing sort of structures which perpetuate the idea of discrimination and inequality. So I think that it's an excellent question to start thinking about this problem when you deal with specific scenarios. Yes.
Thanks. We have 5 minutes left, so I want to ask you three something. Would you rather address 1 or 2 other questions, or would you rather have some 2 minutes each to wrap up?
More questions?
Okay, more questions. Is it okay with Emiliano and Jana?
Sure.
Okay, perfect. Then, sorry,
Or Emily, in any case, we can also afterwards leave our email. That would be very interesting. Because I didn't have the time of looking at all the chats, the chat question, but I'm sure that there might be a lot of very interesting questions over there. So maybe we can afterwards share the email address to all of them.
I'm sure the participants would very much appreciate that. So one question to you, Emiliano, and sorry, I'm just gonna. And I don't have COVID-19, I just have really bad hay fever. Just so everybody knows. So Emiliano, for you, from the point of view of generating compliance with IHL, don't you think it's a bit fallacious to use something as subjective as emotions?
Well.
Or are we trying to say that complete compliance with IHL is not possible because of differing emotions?
Mm-hmm. Fallacious, I think it's a word that might describe almost everything we do in this world. It's not fallacious in the sense that what I'm saying is that compliance is not possible.
Mm-hmm.
The whole idea of thinking universally as a way of generating compliance with IHL is, in my opinion, impossible as such. The idea of, again, having a single way of interpreting the best way in order to promote respect for IHL, I think that will fall short as we go into very specific situations. And this is why traditionally we have perceived that IHL is not widely respected. Basically because we tend to focus on the idea that since this has been established at an international level, then it might be very easy in order to just take it down and download it to very specific situations of armed conflict. Quite on the contrary, what I would say is that if you focus on emotions, you might find even more efficient ways of complying. The thing is that these ways of compliance will not be useful from one place to the other one. You should analyze these in-group and out-group ways of emotionally experiencing the situation. And I think that maybe with the example that Joanna was giving, I think this is very clear. You're not going to, you cannot give a general answer concerning how religious leadership might be useful in order to generate compliance, but analyzing very specific situations in which specific leaders have certain roles to play, and therefore in some specific communities, then compliance might be generated thanks to this very specific approach. I would say that instead of being fallacious, I think it's even more efficient. It means that we can all, in a certain point, do something in order to ensure compliance. I mean, it has to do with the individual possibilities within very specific emotional networks. So, I mean, there's a role to play for all of us.
Thanks. And one last question that is for you, Joanna.
Can I just come in on this? Yeah, if you don't mind. And then we can, because we're out of time. So if it's all right, if the person that asked the question can just email me, and I'm happy to discuss further. I really, Emiliano, what Emiliano is saying speaks very much to me, and I think it's a reality of our gendered education, and we do assimilate emotion with female. And I have so many students coming to my office, and when they didn't do something or something, they're apologizing for being emotional. And I'm like, no, it's perfectly fine. It's very good to be emotional. So we should question our bias against emotion also based on our structural, the structural gendered internalization of our bias against emotion. The second thing that I wanted to say, and I really want to finish with COVID-19 because you reminded me, I would just want you to think about whether the level of compliance that exists, and it is quite remarkable, despite the many breaches of some famous governmental advisors in the UK, but in other countries, with the COVID-19 lockdown, it's quite extraordinary what we have lived this past 2 months. And the way we complied is also remarkable. And this compliance, you simply cannot explain it away without emotion. From the clapping in the evenings for the health services and the other essential workers, this is what in a sense, and I'm sorry if I'm trivializing what you're saying, Emiliano, but this is what emotion can achieve. You just can't have it otherwise. And it's not just the fear of getting COVID-19, and it's not the fear of the fines or prison or whatever. It is our emotion that, and legitimacy and so on. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Joanna, for this final word. Thank you, Katherine and Emiliano, for this very thought-provoking discussion that has encouraged me and I hope all of you to think about compliance differently, to think about IHL differently, and compliance with IHL, but also compliance with little social norms that we all abide to on a daily basis. Thank you to all our participants. We've had between 50 and 100 of you, including from Bamako and other places. So I hope you enjoyed and learned from the discussion as much as I did, and I look forward to having you again virtually or physically at the Geneva Academy. Have a good
day. Soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Moderating.
Please, I think this goes for all of us. Please do email us with comments and questions, feedback, because we're all working on these projects for a number of years. So contacts are very valuable.
And if you want, the Academy would be more than happy to provide you with the panelists' email addresses, or we can just put them at the end of the chat. If you three are okay to do that, I think that might be easiest.
Yeah, we can write it there.
Okay, perfect.